So let's welcome our first speaker, who is Holly Lawford-Smith. Holly is an associate professor in political philosophy at the University of Melbourne. Her book, Gender Critical Feminism, is coming out with Oxford University Press in May. Holly has spoken at previous IWD Brisbane Meanjin events, and we warmly welcome her back. Her topic today is SOGI, the pairing of GI with SO to advance the GI agenda, and she'll tell you what that all means. Thanks, Holly.
I spoke last year about the conversion therapy legislation that had been recently passed in Victoria and had been already introduced in slightly more limited forms in Queensland and ACT. The acts in all three states pair gender identity and sexual orientation together, the GI and the SO in SOGI, and they prohibit conversion therapy against them, although Victoria, for annoying reasons, uses the more expansive phrase change or suppression practices. So the underlying ideology seems to be that sexual orientations and gender identities are things that people have and can't help having. They are innate, they are immutable, and so they're outside of people's control. And importantly, they don't hurt anyone else. For those assumed reasons, it's wrong to stigmatize them and it's harmful to try to change them. The Victorian Act asserts that no sexual orientation or gender identity constitutes a disorder, disease, illness, deficiency, or shortcoming, and that change or suppression practices are deceptive and harmful. And they're deceptive, so the thought goes, precisely because they don't work. Tasmania is considering introducing conversion therapy legislation too, and in November 2020, the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute issued issues paper number 31, titled Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity Conversion Practices. Things don't seem to have moved very much since then, although that was a while ago, because as far as I can find, there has still been no bill introduced, and the project is still listed as ongoing on the TLRI's website as of last week. So it was part of, is that the term? Oh, sorry, that's wrong. There we are. So it's part of the TLRI's terms of reference that they would, that's down at 3, arrows in the wrong place, but just look down a little bit, review and consider peer-reviewed literature about the impacts of SOGI conversion practices on people who are subjected to them and or who have survived them. Oh yeah, it's in the right place, I just got the number wrong. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this talk is focus on that report, and in particular on what the peer-reviewed literature on conversion therapy actually does show and not show. So what I did is read all of it and sort it into 4 categories. So they in their literature review, they said there were 35 papers, so that's their corpus. So these are the categories that seemed right to me. Category A is your most relevant category. It would mean that the article explicitly includes transgender people or talks about gender identity in relation to conversion therapy. That is a relevant paper. Category B is the borderline case that a big fan could argue is relevant. Category C is papers that contain some word or other that could, if you just search the PDF at a really rapid pace, make you think that the paper was relevant, but it isn't. And category D is papers that don't even contain one relevant term. So all the C and D papers were squarely about conversion therapy for sexual orientation, and there were 32 papers in those 2 categories in total. And the arrows, just to explain, I initially put 3 papers in category B, but I also then emailed their authors to ask about my wildly generous interpretation, and they said, no, that's ridiculous. So I moved them into category C. So that's why there's just one left. Okay, so what I'm going to do is just give you an example from each category so you have a sense of the texture of the stuff, and then that's basically all I'm going to do, really. Okay, so Dalmas, if that's how you say it, I have no idea. This paper is called 3 Harms of Conversion Therapy. It appears in the journal Age of Neuroscience. It's a rejoinder to a bioethics paper that's arguing for sexual orientation biotechnology in a limited number of cases, namely cases where people feel tension between their religious identity and their sexual identity, and it would genuinely make them happier to change their sexual identity. So it's a thought experiment sci-fi type paper in the first place, and this is a rejoinder to that paper. So it's not doing science. There are no keywords in the paper relevant to trans, and the paper is exclusively about sexual orientation and future biotechnology. So that's category D, your least relevant, no case for being relevant category. Okay, category C, so Beckstead, 2012, is called Can We Change Sexual Orientation? And it appears in the Archives of Sexual Behaviour. Again, it is exclusively about sexual orientation and the possibility of reorientation for people whose sexual orientations are unwanted. Now, the words gender identity do appear in the paper, but they do not mean trans. So they mean something like the features of a person that relate to his or her sex. So they're sort of using gender as a euphemism for sex and then identity in relation to that. So it appears in the context of talking about how same-sex attractions can disrupt normal relationships between people of the same sex. So I put this in category C because I thought, as I mentioned already, a person doing a really lazy search of a PDF might come across the term gender identity and then sort of assume that that paper about conversion therapy is relevant to trans people, but it isn't. Okay. Let's talk about the more interesting categories, B and C. So Ryan et al. 2020 is called Parent-Initiated Sexual Orientation Change Efforts with LGB Adolescents, Implications for Young Adult Mental Health and Adjustment, and that's in the Journal of Homosexuality. I class this study as borderline because while it's exclusively about the conversion of sexual orientation in young adults initiated by their parents, it surveys 245 participants who self-identify as LGBT. And it reports in its demographics section that 46.5% of the participants were male, 44.9% were female, and 8.6% were transgender. So it's kind of relevant. But wait, the questions that were asked in the survey of the participants were about attempts to cure, treat, or change sexual orientations. And in the notes, the authors say that all of the transgender youth in the study also identified as lesbian or gay, bisexual, homosexual, or queer. So I emailed the author and I asked, did you collect data on the sexual orientations of the trans subjects? Given that a gay identifying trans person is actually a straight person, it seems that only the bisexual or queer identifying trans participants would stand any chance of actually having been subject to conversion therapy for their sexual orientations. So if they pass as the opposite sex, then they were in fact subject to, I know this is probably getting confusing because it's ridiculous. If they pass, then I think they would have been subject to reverse conversion therapy to change them from straight to gay.
Yeah.
Which might not work the same way.
Yeah.
And if they don't pass, there might be reason to disbelieve that they were in fact subject to conversion therapy for their sexual orientations. Either way, the study is still about sexual orientation, not gender identity, conversion therapy. So even though it includes people who happen to have gender identities among those who have sexual orientations. So it gets a little bit confusing, but my conclusion was, arguably, it's not relevant. so that's why it's in category B. I think a die-hard person really committed to making the case could say it's a bit relevant because it's got some trans people in it. Okay. Remember, there was one paper in that category. Okay, now we are at category A, which was the relevant category. So I'm going to talk about both of these, starting with Solway 2020. This is about SOGI, and this is actually the original term, and should be the term, sexual orientation change efforts, SOCE rather than SOGI. And the paper is about SOGI in sexual minority men. Guess what country did this study? Canada. And okay, so they include trans men among the sexual minority men. Okay? So just like the Ryan paper we just talked about in category B, it's still about conversion of sexual orientation. That's still their interest in the paper. Now, of 8,388 respondents, 99 were trans, so that's less than 1.2%. And of those 99, 12.1% said they had been exposed to SOGI, sexual orientation change efforts. Okay, if we're being super charitable, it's possible that the trans men were understanding SOGI to be about both their sexual orientation and their gender identity. But the study doesn't ask, bafflingly, whether the conversion therapy that they experienced was done on the basis of their sexual orientations or their gender identities. It doesn't ask. I emailed the lead author and he confirmed that they didn't ask questions that would allow that disambiguation. They did, to their credit, realize that they should have asked about that, and they did do a more recent study where they were more careful about that. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, so like the Ryan study in category, I've forgotten which way around we go, but the one before, B, like B, this could be about straight people claiming to have had conversion therapy for their sexual orientations. They're just claiming a minority sexual orientation on the basis of the gender identity. So 12.1% of 99 is about 12 people. These are not large numbers, but the study's conclusion is that trans people are disproportionately exposed to conversion therapy. Why? Because in terms of overall percentages, it's 12.1% of the tiny number of trans men, while it's only 3.5% of the much larger cohort of gay men. I hope I'm not making you all not trust academia anymore. Okay, final paper is this Wright et al. 2018. This is a meta-study, which means a paper that's reporting on the rest of the papers that are relevant in the literature. This meta-study, they go through, they get a huge corpus, and then they rule out all the irrelevant ones, and then they whittle it down. They got down to finding that on conversion therapy for gender identity in 2018, there were 4 papers in the scientific literature that were relevant to conversion therapy for gender identity. Of those 4 papers, 3 were about single individual case studies. So these are like therapists, clinicians working with a trans man or a trans woman or a non-binary person and just telling about the clinical experience. So you've got 3 people on the record saying they had experienced conversion therapy. And then, this is like my favorite thing, the final one, the 4th, was about a small cohort of 7 children. And in this study of 7 children, this was at Kenneth Zucker's lab, if you call it a lab clinic, parents brought their children who had gender dysphoria, so young children with gender dysphoria, they bring their children to this Canadian gender clinic, hoping for the outcome of desistance. Yeah. Okay, given that most childhood gender dysphoria resolves naturally, so there's desistance naturally in most cases, it's not clear that that should be counted as conversion therapy. So it's been counted as conversion therapy for the purpose of the literature. So only 7 children, but the fact that they're being taken to this clinic and that desistance is the desired outcome, it's being counted as conversion. So I think the way to summarize what the meta-study shows is that we've got one paper that might have been about a small number of people's conversion therapy for gender identity, but might just as well not have been, because it might have been about their sexual orientations. We don't know. And then we've got 3 papers that are about one person each about conversion therapy for gender identity. Okay. So I think the big takeaway, if you're ever talking to anyone about the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute's report, or about Tasmania getting conversion therapy legislation, or really just about conversion therapy bills in any state or country, is that the evidence base is by a great majority relevant to sexual orientation and not gender identity. I think loads of us knew this instinctively, right? But I wanted to check just to make sure and to see kind of how egregious the problem was. So of the 35 papers that the TLRI reviewed, only 2 out of 35 even talk about gender identity. The rest, 33 out of 35, talk exclusively about sexual orientation. Of the 2 papers that do talk about gender identity, one fails to distinguish whether the conversion therapy was done on the basis of the transgender person's sexual orientation, gender identity, or both. And the other reports from this literature review in 2018 that there are only 4 papers at that time relevant to conversion therapy and gender identity. And one of those, as I've explained already, is arguably not about conversion therapy at all. And the remaining 3 are about one person each between them. So I think it's fair to conclude from this that there's an insufficient evidence base to support legislation against conversion therapy for gender identity. There's little evidence that it's happening. There's little evidence about whether it's effective if and when it does happen. And there's little evidence on whether it's harmful to have been exposed to attempts to convert your gender identity. Okay, so I'm going to finish by just looking back at the overview that the TLRI gave in their report of their review of the peer literature. So first underline, second bullet point, that's false. They say available peer-reviewed literature. Yeah. They look at some literature, but they do not look at the available peer-reviewed literature. There are papers that are cited within the 35 papers that are way more relevant to gender identity and conversion therapy and that they didn't then bring in. And they claim, I think it's in there, oh sorry, it's elsewhere in the report, but they claim, do I have it? Yeah, they state in the report, these sources were gathered through keyword searches in major research databases and by following up citations in the studies found in these searches to find additional sources on the impacts of SOGI conversion practices that were missed in the initial keyword search. That would be standard social science methodology, you kind of snowball, and they didn't. Because I think, did I put the numbers? My research assistant and I did a broad search, so just in the citations in their 35 papers, there were a further 19 that they didn't include. And then we did our own search and found a further 43 that seem relevant, that we still need to read through and see whether they are ultimately relevant. So there's like lots of things that they didn't even look at is the short answer. The third bullet point is also false. So they say there's no convincing evidence that SOGI conversion practices are effective. I think that's just political. There is some, actually, and that's probably hard to talk about or know, but there is some once you read through the literature. So there is some convincing evidence that sexual orientation conversion practices are effective. Maybe they're not using the word convincing in a scientific way there. They just mean likable or something. That's fine. The fourth bullet point, it's just the GI, right? It's just the GI. It would be true what they're saying there, that there's a sort of conclusion that these conversion practices have harmful effects. They have, I think, shown that for sexual orientation. It's just not true for the gender identity as well. So it's false for SOGI together. There's virtually no data on gender identity conversion practices. And then finally, the fifth bullet point, which I haven't underlined, that's true, but it's often political. So even in the peer-reviewed literature, largely the stuff out of Canada, the political orientations of the authors are sometimes really clear, like right from the first paragraph. Like saying things like, oh, there's a pseudo-scientific, widely debunked literature on conversion therapy being successful, and then with one citation to the one main guy, right? And then not talking at all about the counter evidence. So, and sorry, the other thing is that there is a tendency in that literature that there's a tendency to consider a person's sexual orientation to just be much more important than their religious identity. And so some of the more conservative, I guess, or centre in that way, papers will take that clash more seriously. The person's religious identity can be just as important to them, and they can want to protect that more than their sexual identity. And that's not really taken seriously in what I would say is the more like leftist literature. Okay, I'm nearly done. I wrote to the TLRI mid-February, and I asked them. They know about me because I asked them for the sources. That they don't include the sources in the report. So I've already been in touch. I said, why does the report use...
It's Holly.
Okay. So I asked, why does the report use the term SOGI and make claims about the empirical basis for the effectiveness or harmfulness of SOGI practices instead of the term SOGI, which was the original term in the literature, and which the empirical evidence base is of most direct relevance to. So that's to say, what is the TLRI's justification for talking about sexual orientation and gender identity in relation to conversion practices instead of only sexual orientation? And I also asked whether they had some sort of conceptual or political reason for pairing the two together, and I haven't had any reply yet. So my next steps are going to be to review those next two rounds of papers that I mentioned, the 19 that they should have read because they were cited in the ones they read, and then the 40-something that we found separately, to try to see if anything was overlooked that would help the gender identity case. I guess I'm not holding my breath. And then after that, to kind of try to work out the more philosophical arguments for whether there's a good reason to pair sexual orientation and gender identity together. So why do people think they are the same? Are they actually the same in some way? Are they different? Why? And I think of most interest to me, eventually, when I get to that, is can I show that the gender identity activists are actually just exploiting this pairing so that they can make entirely unwarranted and undesirable legal gains from our perspective? That's it. Thank you.